Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, as part of our series that we call Where Are We Going?, about some of the big questions facing all of us, I'm talking to the writer and journalist Sarah O'Connor about the past, present, and future of work. Sarah writes for the Financial Times. She's an award-winning journalist who has been looking at the changing character of work for nearly 20 years. And she's the author of a really interesting new book called We Are Not Machines. We are talking in part about AI. We are talking about the coming of a new machine age. But this is also a conversation about what work means, why people do it, what they value in the world of work, and whether the changes that are coming are going to destroy the things that we value. Sarah, at the risk of starting with a question that is both unanswerable and a bit pretentious, I want to ask you what work is, because it is one of those words that just covers everything, right? So we use it to mean chores and tasks, and we use it to mean careers and vocations, a sort of spiritual calling. You've written about the world of work for a long time in lots of different contexts. So when you picture the world of work, what do you think of? Are we basically talking about jobs?
I think these days, and in the context of my work, which is to write about what we now describe as labour markets, and, a long time ago we would never have dreamed of describing something as a labour market, then I would now be mostly thinking about jobs, as in something that is part of the formal economy, something for which people are paid, and something which has acquired over the years a lot of sort of political, moral resonance. But you're absolutely right. I mean, even just the concept of a job is a sort of relatively recent concept. I mean, if you go back to, say, the 18th century, the word job sort of existed, but it was a description of something that is a lower class, like a piecing stuff together, a bit like what we would now say a jobbing actor. So I think Samuel Johnson described a job as a low, mean, lucrative, busy affair. This was not something that people of his stature would lower themselves to do. Whereas now, of course, we think of jobs as very central both to our identities and to the health and functioning of the economy and democracy.
Yeah, the definition that I saw of job from that period was it was a lump of work, a lump.
Yeah, like a task, basically.
So one of the things that's happened to the idea of a job is that it has become associated with security, in the sense that this is what you can rely on. So in those earlier definitions, the whole point of it was a kind of piecework. So it was here today, gone tomorrow work. And it is interesting. I mean, there aren't many words that have done such a big arc in their meaning. It almost meant the opposite of secure income. And now it has come to mean one of those things where in the world of work, to have a job is to give you something reliable, which you might not otherwise have in the world of work. Is that a late 19th century, early 20th century shift? Is it to do with managerialism, industrialization? I don't know when it happened, but it's such a big move in one idea of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of begins really with the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of what people used to do, obviously, was they would have a trade, they would have an occupation. There were guilds that would sort of protect those and make sure that you could only enter it if you'd done an apprenticeship, and then that was your sort of lifelong livelihood. There were also people who were agricultural labourers, there were domestic servants, and then there was this shift to factory employment, which feels totally different. You're being hired by an employer to do a certain thing. And to begin with, that too was very precarious. It's not as if the Industrial Revolution happened and suddenly everyone was working, 9 to 5 and they had their rights to unfair dismissal and all the rest of it. I mean, that whole process takes another, 100, 200 years to figure itself out. But the Industrial Revolution is really when you get this sort of separation of life and work as two separate things that often happen in different places. It's also when time takes on a different meaning. Clocks become commonplace in the home and people think about shifts lasting a certain amount of time, and that there will be times for work and times for not work. Whereas, if you were working in cottage industry with your family, work and not work was a much more kind of fluid affair that would coexist throughout the day, a bit like it does now for people who work from home.
For instance, making podcasts. As you say that, I picture my and Helen's working life. It's a cottage industry.
Yeah, it is. You've gone back to the future. So, yes, that's really when work takes on a very different character. But then for that to become something that has the meaning it does now, as in something that is stable and secure and where you have certain rights as well as your employer having rights over you, that there's a sort of mutual set of obligations and responsibilities. I mean, that really takes until the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century with the rise of trade unionism and modern employment contracts. So, yeah, it's a very long process until we get to, I guess, what people now think of as like the heyday of the job, which would be post-World War II male factory jobs, very secure, people expecting to work for life, work very steady hours, have pensions to look forward to at the end of it, and all of the rest of it. And then more recently, I think we've started to have a disintegration of that, and I'm sure we'll come on to that later on.
I was going to say, because we will be talking about machines and what work they can and can't do. One of the ironies of the current anxiety about AI is it's often framed in the language of jobs. Are they going to take the jobs? Will they be doing the jobs? It feels to me that if they were doing the jobs, they wouldn't be jobs, or they would be jobs back in that much earlier Samuel Johnson sense, in that they don't need holidays, they don't need the benefit package, they're not thinking about the dignity of the work that they do. For them, it's just a series of tasks. It's lumps of work. Machines turn work into lumps of work. That's what they do. And the thought is they can do the lumps more efficiently than the humans can do the lumps. And yet we frame it in the language of jobs. It almost might make more sense to say it's not they're coming for our jobs, but they are going to turn our jobs into what job used to mean.
I think that's a good way of thinking about it. And actually, that too has been something that has a long history, right? When a new machine or a new form of automation enters a job which previously it wasn't able to enter, what it often does is it doesn't do it. The employer will redesign that job around what the machine can and can't do, around its strengths and its weaknesses. And, we've seen that plenty of times before. So there'll be certain things that you no longer do, and there will be other things that you do more of. And we're already starting to see that a bit with the introduction of AI into certain jobs. So, if you look at translators, for example, they would previously have been given a text or subtitles for a TV show and be asked to translate them from scratch. And now they're given a machine translation and they're asked to check it, verify it, tidy it up, make it seem a bit more human. And so the job technically still exists, but the nature of that job, the tasks within that job have been completely transformed. And this is, I think, what is often missing in the debate right now, is that partly because economists can measure what they can measure, we're looking for signs of AI disruption in the number of jobs lost or gained. And people at the minute are looking and saying, wow, in spite of all of these sort of apocalyptic or utopian predictions, we're not seeing much happening, actually. We haven't seen vast job losses. We haven't seen even just the natural churn of the labour market is quite low at the minute. If anything, it feels like the calm before the storm, or maybe there won't be a storm. But actually beneath that, within people's jobs, there's an awful lot of transformation beginning to happen.
In your book, you quote someone whose work, and this is a new kind of work, is to sit in front of a screen and oversee humans and machines interacting in a factory to check that the interaction is going well. So these layers of surveillance, I guess you could call it, to keep an eye on the system. And this person says of his work, I don't even know if this is a job or not, which conveys a lot in just the terms that you described, which is they're still framed as jobs. They have that structure around them. You get paid. There are hours, although the hours might be flexible. You don't really go to a workplace. You're doing this on a screen, so you're doing it from home. There's very little interaction. If a job involves being around other people doing similar work, you're not seeing them. But there's a feeling that for this to count as a job, it has to, or it ought to have something. And when the machines are doing so much of it, and you're just the human in the loop, as it's sometimes called, just sort of keeping an eye, it's not a job. So when someone says something like that to you, when you talk to people doing this new kind of work, and they say, I don't even know if this is a job anymore, what do you think is the thing that they think is lost? so that it's not really a job? Is it the security? Is it the sense of identity?
I think it's meaning. I think to sit at a screen all day in your bedroom, far removed, in the case of that person, he was in the Himalayas and he was watching warehouse workers in America and in the United Kingdom literally stacking shelves. So you're so far removed from the thing that you're sort of supposedly the human in the loop for. And the actual job is, you're watching video clips that might last 6, 7, 8 seconds back to back all day long, the same thing over and over and over. And I think it's very hard to have any sense of meaning or connection to what this labour is. What is it for? What is it achieving? And it's lonely. And the other thing that he said to me was like, we didn't even have meetings. How is this a job? There's a sense that a real job involves some sort of collective enterprise in one way or another, and that this was just so remote and weird and repetitive that it just didn't feel like what his perception of a job should be.
Without making this all about me and my cottage industry, but the thing that I've most noticed, having worked for 30 years for a university and then going to being self-employed and creating something, podcasts, is that my life used to be all meetings. So there is that other side of it. So it's very interesting to hear someone saying, oh, there are no meetings, this is not meaningful. And I'm one of those people who feels the great liberation that I've had in moving to a way of work in which I'm able to do it from home and on my own time frame, but also I'm creating something on my own terms, is there aren't any meetings. Both of these things are going on simultaneously. There are the people who feel the absence of meetings is the absence of meaning. And there are people like me who think, how much of the 30 years that I spent working did I spend in meetings? Just think what I could have done.
I think there's two things to say there. One is that you might not be in many meetings anymore, but you do still have human interaction and conversation and things that stimulate your brain probably a lot more than you did before.
Oh, yeah, much more. They're just not in meeting settings. That's what's so great about it.
And therefore, I'm sure they're much more intellectually stimulating. But the other thing to say is that clearly what people value in jobs varies a lot, right? Like some people do value certain types of things and some people value other things. And that sometimes makes this whole conversation about what is good work and what is bad work quite difficult, because I think everyone can agree that there is such a thing as a bad job. But it's also true that over the kind of 15 years that I've written about the world of work, I've met people who love and hate completely different things. And I've met people who would have despised a job that someone else really valued. So this is quite a difficult thing. But I think about this question quite a lot in the context of this latest sort of phase of automation, where people are very anxious about what will happen to their jobs and the meaning within their jobs. And I think that already you can see examples of automation which is stripping meaning from a job. And so those translators that I talked about are a really good example, because for them, the act of translating, the act of actually taking something and rendering the meaning of those words in a different language is truly fulfilling and what they love to do. And that's the bit that they've lost. Whereas if you look at software developers, for example, a lot of software developers now don't write code by hand. And while some of them have found that quite disorientating, I think probably a lot of them, I also get the sense of a lot of exhilaration and excitement, because actually writing code by hand was not the thing that most coders loved about their jobs. What they loved was like the solving of problems, and the code was a means to an end. And so if you can offload that bit to a machine, then in a sense, your job has the capacity to become more interesting and more meaningful. And so it really matters which tasks within your job are the ones that get automated, and whether they're the ones that you care about or the ones that you don't.
We're going to come back to the machines, but I want to ask you about one of the other words that you've used in this conversation that gets equated with work, but can also mean something different, which is labour. So labour is a word that gets used a lot. And of course, it also means lots of different things. It means the party of government in the United Kingdom, for instance. And the phrase, the dignity of labour, is one that is associated with the idea of the dignity of work. Hannah Arendt distinguished between labour and work. So she argued that the key distinction, there's a separate distinction in the world of politics, but the key distinction in the world of work, broadly speaking, is between labour, which is driven by necessity, and essentially is part of the natural cycle of life. So the most basic form of labour is all human beings need to somehow extract enough calories in order to survive. And that, for most of human history, has been back-breaking labour. And even labour, she said, in a factory setting in the 19th century, had much more in common with that than what we would think of as the world of work, in that it was to stop people from starving or to provide enough for their families to be able to eat. And then work for Arendt is the world of artificial creation, in the sense when people do an act of work, what they are doing is building something that doesn't have to be built, but is being built for some or other reason by choice. Do you think that distinction still has any meaning, in the sense that it is possible to separate out the kind of work which is primarily driven by necessity and the kind of work which is a matter of choice? Or are we in a world in which, because we all still need to eat, right? And most of us therefore need to have a source of income which allows us to eat, though the state will provide for people who can't. Do you think that distinction still has any force?
Yeah, I think that distinction definitely still has meaning. And I think that a lot of what people feel discomforted about the process of industrialization is, Arendt said that what happened with industrialization was that things that used to be work, for example, making a table, making some object which is going to then be used and have a life and exist outside of use, a task that has a beginning and an end. You start to make the table, you finish to make the table. That once you turn the making of tables into an industrialized process with the division of labor, it becomes an act of labor rather than an act of work. So, you working in the factory, you might just be screwing one leg into one part of the table over and over and over again. And then it starts to fit her definition of labor. It's something that is sort of endless.
Repetitive is a key part of it.
Repetitive. You're only doing it really so that you can eat. You're not kind of attached to the meaning of the end product anymore. And she was so perceptive, Arendt, because she also said that this transforms the way we consume those things, right? So that then a table ceases to be something that you value and use for its long lifespan and becomes another thing that you just consume, when we start to consume durable things in the way that we would consume, fruit that's going to go rotten soon. And I think that people still feel that quite acutely. I don't think that most people sort of think about it in those specific terms, but I think that I think that idea still resonates, that often work should have more meaning than it does, or that's something that you actually do value and you want to create something beautiful or meaningful in the world becomes a bit of a slog for one reason or another. And again, I think that's something that we see those anxieties throughout the conversation now around AI entering the creative industries, for example. Will creating a book become actually something that is just a kind of endless laboring process because you're just putting the prompts in and churning the thing out? And will we start to consume books the way we consume other kind of consumer goods? Personally, I'm sort of hopeful that that won't be the case, but I think that distinction does still hold and people do still think about it a lot.
When I read Arendt on labour and work, I was struck by the thing that you've just mentioned there. One of her amazing insights, because it was from the 1950s, is that consumption is going to turn into a form of labour, in the sense that there is a world coming, an automated world, she thought, in which the way that we consume things, including what we might call consumer goods, so things that we might think are actually about beautifying the home or making our lives more comfortable or more luxurious or more interesting, it's going to require a relentless quality. And so, for instance, the person that we talked about, the human in the loop who is sitting in the Himalayas and watching an Amazon warehouse and checking that the tasks are being performed, all of us will have some echo of recognition there, because it's a bit like being on Amazon and buying stuff. The 6, 7, 8 second cycles, the relentless prompting, the fact that it is repetitive and never ending, a world of consumption in which the act of consumption is the point of it. It's not to have a thing that you value and use and will endure. The endless, repetitive buying and buying and buying of new stuff. And it is interesting that someone writing in the 1950s could glimpse a world in which labour is coming back, not simply because we were going to be doing mindless jobs, but the world of increasingly mindless jobs would spread into the world of what we do with the products of those jobs. It felt like a vision of the Bezos universe.
Totally. I mean, the first time I read it, I underlined that paragraph and wrote the word Amazon next to it. And she was, as a result, she was very pessimistic about the idea of a kind of fully automated future. She didn't think that Marx's sort of hope that if you automate away the need for labour, that everyone will be freed up to go back to doing work, with a capital W, doing meaningful things, becoming sort of philosophers and sitting around and doing great stuff. She thought that actually we would just fill our time with consumption, that this is the way it would go. I mean, it's a kind of a bleak vision, and I don't know that she would necessarily be proved right in the end, but that was why she was so kind of sceptical, I think, about those visions of a fully automated life of luxury.
One of the other things that she feared was coming, and she was right, partly because it had already arrived, so this wasn't prophetic, was that between labour and work, the thing that would get prioritised in the world of work, let's call it, was efficiency. And efficiency is in a strange sort of hybrid place between labour and work, in the sense that it isn't necessary. You can have a world of labour in which people are trying to get enough food to eat, which isn't driven by efficiency. You can have certain earlier ways of life. Most of the human condition, as she would call it, has been lived under conditions driven by labour, but not by efficiency. The question is not what is the most efficient way to extract calories. It's just, can we get enough calories to survive? And you might do that very inefficiently, but it might be a way to live. And then work, which is also not meant to be about efficiency, because it is meant to be about creating the object for its own sake. But actually, the thing that really drives the world of work, and this is a story from the 19th century through the 20th century, is to create ever more efficiency gains. So the history of that is interesting. I want to ask you about two stages in it, which both have got an ism on them. You've written a lot about both. Taylorism and Fordism, two names attached to two ways of driving efficiency. So what is Taylorism?
So Frederick Winslow Taylor was an engineer in the early 20th century in America. He was from quite a kind of well-to-do family, but he was, very technically minded, actually very gifted engineer. And so he entered the world of industry. But what he became obsessed with was not actually engineering, but management, because what he kind of saw in those workplaces of the early 20th century was inefficiency. He saw inefficiency everywhere in the way in which people were managed and how quickly they produced the goods that they were meant to be producing. And he invented something that he called scientific management. So his real insight was that the problem was that there was this, an economist would call it an information asymmetry. So the workers had all of the knowledge about how their jobs should be done. They were the experts. They knew how to craft steel or whatever it was. And the managers didn't. And therefore, for one thing, the workers might all have their own slightly idiosyncratic ways of doing things. They hadn't all converged on the one best, most efficient way. But also the managers had no idea whether the workers were working as hard as they could. And Taylor was convinced that they were often slacking off, or what he called soldiering, that the managers had no power to do anything about this because they just simply didn't have enough information about how quickly these things could be done. And so what he did was basically he kind of sent people out onto the shop floor with stopwatches and papers, and he measured how people did their jobs. He tracked everything about them, and he came up with what he called scientific measures of the best way that every single task in a given workplace ought to be done. The idea really was to kind of separate the thinking part and the doing part, and the thinking part would now be for management to dominate, and the workers would then execute what management told them to execute. And so workers would literally, in some of the places where he implemented this, they would arrive at the start of their day. They would get a slip of paper from a pigeonhole that says, this is the job you have to do today. This is the tool that you need to use to do it. This is how long it ought to take you. And if you haven't done it adequately the next day, then this slip of paper will be a different colour and you will be in trouble. Now, Taylor said that this was a win-win for both the employer and the workers, because what it did was improve efficiency. And when you improve efficiency, I mean, you said that it's not really necessary, but by this point in the early 20th century, we're well past the Industrial Revolution. We've escaped from the Malthusian trap, and most people recognize that actually becoming more efficient at doing things is really good in many ways, because it enables societies to become richer. It enables goods to become cheaper, and therefore more people can afford them and enjoy them, and it just raises the standard of living. So most people are in agreement that more efficiency is a good thing, and that, the workers and trade unions at the time would have agreed with that too. But the issue was that workers just hated this. for understandable reasons, it doesn't feel good when you used to be in control of what you did. You had the knowledge, you had the skills, you knew which tools to use, you worked at a pace that you thought was reasonable. And suddenly all of your autonomy is being taken away. And, some of the workers would say to Taylor, like, you're trying to turn me into a wooden man, like an automaton. This is before the word robot has really been invented. But that's the idea that they were trying to get at. It's like, you're trying to turn me into a robot here. But actually, it was effective. So although trade unions pushed back very hard against it in the early 20th century, Taylorism as an idea, as a kind of underpinning management philosophy, took off. And, it still exists today. I mean, I would say these days it exists as a sort of an undercurrent, except for, of course, in workplaces like Amazon, where you might say that it's a very clear Tayloristic management culture.
One of the things that's so interesting about that, it does clearly seem to foreshadow, as you say, a kind of Amazonified world in which the humans in the warehouses aren't that different from the robots. But it is fascinating that the original information asymmetry, and I hadn't really understood this until I read you describing it, was that the workers had the knowledge and the management was just clueless. And the key task was for the management essentially to take the knowledge from the workers and claim it as their own. So I'd understood Taylorism as the managers kind of coming in and telling the workers what to do. But the prior stage to that was the managers coming in and extracting intellectual value from the workers. The workers knew how the machines worked, the managers didn't. So the first thing the managers had to do was to take that. And that does also seem to foreshadow our world in which the machines are now telling us how to do these jobs, but only because they have extracted from us the knowledge of how to do these jobs. It is a hyper-Taylorist world that we live in. We're getting instructions that seem to come from outside, but the machines wouldn't know how to do it if we hadn't sort of told them. But of course, we haven't told them because they haven't asked us. They've just taken the information from us. So in some ways, it's not just that the factories and the warehouses in which people work have got robots in them. It's the pure Taylorism of it's our knowledge that's been taken by these machines and then packaged back to us as though it was their knowledge.
Yeah, and in some cases, that is happening very literally. If you look at companies like Merkel, this is a company that is hiring people in all kinds of professions, journalists, lawyers, doctors, management consultants. It's paying them it's not hiring them in the sense of a job, to go back to our previous description, but it's hiring them by the hour to train large language models and AI agents how to do their jobs. And you'll be paid pretty handsomely, like several £100 an hour, to literally step by step explain this is what a journalist does all day and this is how it does it. And that, so that knowledge can be extracted and then monetized in a completely different way.
And you said that by the start of the 20th century, in a way, it was almost impossible to resist the idea that efficiency is a good. But I still think in Arendt's terms, it is clearly not a necessity. We know that you can live, you can survive, indeed you can flourish, leading an inefficient life. And there are lots of philosophical movements of all sorts, not all of them utopian, that absolutely champion them. And also economic movements. Degrowth is a movement that says, if we are going to survive, we need to escape from the god of efficiency. And yet, again, in that Taylorist way, it feels like we are living in a world in which efficiency is presented as necessity. And this may be a function of capitalism, but there is no survival for the inefficient. So it can be sort of pseudo-evolutionary, the argument, or it can just be taken for granted that in a world in which other people are becoming more efficient, if you don't play that game, you will die. And that also feels like it's a hyper-Taylorist world that we're living in now.
Yeah, I suppose it depends whether you're thinking about it as an individual or with more of a kind of view of the economy as a whole, right? I mean, to put my Financial Times journalist hat on, we've just spent 10, 15 years in the UK at a time where we have had zero productivity growth. And it hasn't been much fun, right? When productivity doesn't rise, real wages don't rise. The pie isn't growing, and therefore you have much fiercer distributional fights over who should get what size of the pie. So, I mean, I completely agree on a sort of personal, individual level. This sense that we should constantly be more efficient feels uncomfortable for many, and I think rightly so. I think sometimes we sort of take what is true at a macro level and we apply it to ourselves as individuals, which isn't really what human beings are. But definitely from an economic point of view, I think it's hard to make well, clearly there are people who do make degrowth arguments, but I think we can see over the last 10 years that a lack of growth isn't a huge amount of fun.
At the risk of dragging us into a topic that is not the subject of this conversation, Brexit itself was partly pushed by its proponents as an argument that said there might be more important things. Probably they wouldn't have put it as efficiency, but they would have said as the goals that economists set for us. One of those things they might have said, indeed many of them did say, was sovereignty, a nebulous concept. But it was an argument that did have some purchase. Some people said the economic projections of Brexit are simply wrong, but other people said there are more important things than those economic projections. And as you say, we've lived through an experiment and it hasn't been much fun, in the sense that I don't think many people now are thinking that sovereignty is the thing that they want to prioritise above growth. So it's a hard argument to make, for sure. But again, I think Arendt would say it is still crucial not to collapse into the space of labour necessity, things that are not quintessentially necessities. They can be presented and packaged as such, but that's almost where you need to be wary.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we see that a lot now. And I talk to a lot of artists and musicians and writers and people who are both enraged and baffled by the encroachment upon their profession by technology companies who have said, well, we figured out a more efficient way that you could create this painting, or a more efficient way that you could write this essay or book, or a more efficient way that you could write this Hollywood film script. And isn't this great? This is like a new paintbrush for you. Or this is a new tool in your toolbox and it can make you more efficient. And what these artists say is like, that is to completely misunderstand what art is. Art is not a process of trying to do things quickly. Like, there are some things that humans do, and some of them have economic value as well, that are not about efficiency, that the effort, in fact, is the whole point. And as someone who has just written a book, I can confirm that, it was very effortful, but that if I had been given the opportunity to sort of fast forward or create 10 books in the 2 years that took me to create one, I would say, like, no, thank you. That would be to completely miss the point of why I did this. And I think that there's this real disconnect psychologically between the technology companies who think that efficiency is a good thing always and everywhere for every task, for everything, and people who work in professions where efficiency really isn't the goal, where the goal is something else, and where actually prioritizing efficiency strips out all of the things that really do matter.
There was that notorious Apple ad, I think, for the iPad, where they took all of the symbols of the creative life, pianos and violins and paintbrushes, and crushed them into an iPad. And then various people said this ad works much better if you play it backwards and you blow up the iPad, and out of it, we need to rescue those things. Fordism, the second of these early 20th century moves, it's distinct from Taylorism, and I think it's important to understand the ways in which it's distinct. Both of them fed into dystopian literature of the period. So I'm going to do a podcast soon about Brave New World. Anyone who's read Brave New World will remember that the god in Brave New World is Ford, and people say, by Ford, where they would have said, by God, what is this? What is Fordism? How is Fordism different from Taylorism? Because Fordism is also about efficiency.
I think Taylorism is a precursor to Fordism, certainly. But I think what we now think of as Fordism is not just the change in the production process, but everything that went with it in terms of this creation of a 9-to-5 job, a 40-hour work week, the creation of a weekend, the understanding that you should be paying your workers enough that they can then afford to buy your products. So those are sort of two different things, and I think they happen sequentially. So the first thing that happens is the change in the production process. So cars used to be made a bit like houses are made now. They'd be in one place and the workers would wander around and get their tools and do their things. And Ford's great innovation was the production line, right? It actually isn't an automation thing. It's an organization of work thing. So once you have a moving line, you have the workers standing still, and you simply have the workers do one thing over and over again on each car as it goes past. And this was massively more productive. And so we saw that then extend into all kinds of other industries as well. But, lo and behold, a bit like the workers that Taylor was experimenting on, people didn't really love this way of working. It's pretty dull, repetitive. It was also quite dangerous at the time. The hours were long. And so labour turnover was extremely high in Ford's factories to begin with. And at that point, Ford decided to raise pay, to shorten the working hours. And I don't think it was really out of any sense of benevolence. He certainly was no friend to the trade union movement, for example. But I think he saw that actually there needs to be a quid pro quo here. He didn't think it was a problem that he had created sort of boring, repetitive jobs. In fact, he thought that a lot of people were quite happy doing boring, repetitive work so long as they were adequately paid for it and that they were given enough time off. And so Fordism, I think, now encapsulates both of those things, the improved production methods, but also the idea that there should be a quid pro quo for working in a pretty tough factory job. And that should be that you are paid well enough to sustain a family life and look forward to a comfortable retirement one day.
In some ways, the golden age of jobs that you mentioned at the beginning, the post-war era, it was also the Fordist era. So work in some ways became worse. As you've described it, it's less fun, it's more boring, it's more repetitive. It's more like labour in Arendt's terms to be standing on a production line. And we've all seen versions of that, even if it's just in TV shows recreating a factory in which it looks completely mindless. But you can build around that job security, holidays, better pay, that makes it an attractive option relative to what else is on offer. And what else is on offer might simply be unemployment in many parts of the country. And that was the golden period of jobs. We're no longer in that age. The 30 glorious years are over, and the 30 glorious years after those are over, and it's a different labour and work environment. Do you think it is still Fordist? So, for instance, you write about your experience in Amazon factories over a decade, a bit more than a decade apart. And I had no idea that I'd never been in an Amazon factory. I'm sure lots of people reading you will not know what it's like in there. But I had no idea that 15 years ago, people would come to work dressed for the gym because it was so physically arduous, because there was a lot of running around in order to do this in time, get the product, because it is, to the human eye, chaotic, the storage. You had to move around a lot to find the right thing and package it up. And it has now moved to a much more static thing. The robots are running around and the humans are in place. And it just read very Fordist. It read like a classic Fordist efficiency. So is Bezosism just Fordism, do you think? Or is a Bezosist world different?
I mean, I think Bezosism is Fordism without the quid pro quo, right? And I think that's why people find it troubling, and it's why trade unions have been trying desperately for a decade and a half to unionize those workplaces, because I don't think Amazon is a terrible employer. I mean, I think they do what they need to do to make sure that the jobs are filled and that people are kind of relatively safe. But I don't think many people would argue with the idea that it's pretty boring and that it's probably got more boring over time. So, yeah, it used to be that you might walk sort of 10 or 15 miles a day working in an Amazon warehouse because you're just walking around between all the shelves. And more recently, with the introduction of robots, they've basically created effectively a production line. So the workers now stand in one place and the robots bring the shelves to the workers. And the workers will take the object off, and then the shelf will be taken away and the next shelf will come. And the reason that the robots aren't also doing the dexterous job of picking the things off the shelves is because robot hands aren't really as good as human hands yet. And so that's a pretty dull, lonely job. But Amazon does not pay the sorts of wages that Ford used to pay. Amazon jobs, they're not minimum wage jobs anymore. Amazon has definitely kind of improved its pay and conditions over time. And they actually do have some quite good policies around things like offering workers the chance to train in something new. But they're definitely not, sort of middle class jobs that one person could have an Amazon job and their wife could afford not to work and their children can expect to go on holiday once or twice a year. That's not what that is. So in a way, it's the production techniques of Fordism and the management philosophy of Taylorism, but without, I think, the idea that these jobs also have to pay a pretty decent wage and deliver a lot of security at the same time.
Does that say something about the current working environment, that for now at least that model seems sustainable? Because as you described the Ford version of this earlier, it was the pressure of people leaving that forced him. He was not a benevolent human being. He was really horrible. But market forces drove him to create what we now think of as the golden age of work. for that kind of work. So what does it say about the current age of work that, for now at least, Bezosism seems able to function without the benefits that Ford was driven to provide?
I mean, it wasn't just market forces, it was also trade unions. And Ford and other car companies fought bitter, sometimes very violent, physically violent battles with trade unions at the beginning of that era. And I think that's one of the core differences is, when Amazon emerged, we'd had already sort of 20 years of the decline of trade unions, of the decline of collective bargaining, and even the idea in America that that would be a good or a normal thing in a lot of jobs. And so there isn't that external pressure either. What you've seen a lot of is kind of civil society pressure, journalists. I mean, there was one point in the mid 2010s when there were so many journalists working undercover in Amazon warehouses. I was actually worried they were going to start interviewing each other about how miserable they were. So there has been a lot of sort of social pressure. It's not as if this has sort of happened and everyone has kind of shrugged and said, oh, well, that's fine. And trade unions continue to work very hard to try and get a foothold there. But, the other thing is that a lot of Amazon warehouses, they have a lot of migrant workers. And I think the unions are struggling to unionize migrants in large numbers. Not everywhere, but it can be a more difficult job. They might be moving in and out quite a lot. There might be different understandings of what trade unionism is. It's also just sort of generational change. I mean, I interviewed an Amazon worker who joined the union, fought with the union for a while, and then his situation got better and he thought, oh, well, I don't need the union anymore, so I'll quit, because why would I keep paying for a service that I no longer need? And this is like a completely different perception of what trade unions are for from a couple of generations ago, right? Where workers in a car factory would join the union because that's just what you did and that's what you were expected to do. And that if you weren't doing that, you were a kind of free rider. Now I think unions really struggle with a perception from younger people in particular that unions are kind of a service like any other that you can pay for when you need them and stop paying for when you don't.
There's a new book called Muskism that argues that actually we're entering a new era. So this isn't post-Fordism, it's not even Bezosism. There is another attempt being made to restructure, as Ford did, not just the workplace, but the society that surrounds the workplace, so that that society suits the kind of work that's being done. And therefore Muskism is a philosophy because it's a philosophy of society as well as of work. Do you think there is a thing called Muskism? I'm not 100% clear what it is, but do you think A, it exists, and B, we may be entering that world?
Yeah, it's a really interesting book. I mean, they argue that Muskism is, I think they call it sort of fortress futurism. So this idea that actually we are now in a hostile world and there are people that should be inside the fortress and people that should be outside the fortress. And that if you sort of go along with Musk's products and services and everything that Musk is trying to do, if you kind of get inside his fortress, then you have a certain amount of freedom, but on his terms, and you're still very reliant on everything that he provides, both to the state and to individuals. But that this is a kind of philosophy for like a hostile world, not a globalized world in which everyone can be welcome. I think there's something to that. I mean, I think Musk is quite a difficult character to pin a kind of overriding philosophy onto, because he's very chaotic, and quite often he espouses lots of different opinions, sometimes like all in the same day, it seems to me. But I do think that there's clearly been, as we all know, a sort of shift from the era of globalization to something that feels much more, if not protectionist, then people are retreating into their own spheres of influence. The idea that the only way to get by is to lower your barriers both to people and to goods. I think that idea is clearly very much out of fashion. I mean, in a way, I think Palantir is a more interesting example of an attempt to create a sort of philosophy for the future, very sort of security minded. But I guess both Alex Karp, who runs Palantir, and Elon Musk, they both sort of share this obsession with like the West and Western civilization, and that this must be preserved, and that technology is some way of preserving that. Whether and how that then extends to the world of work, I think is less clear to me.
One of the ways in which it is different from Fordism, as you suggested, is that the Musk view is inside the fortress, things will be integrated. So you can almost lead a Muskist life because you will be provided not simply with your cars, but with your information tools, your knowledge environment will be created in that way. You'll use their AI products. And Musk was one of the first people who tried to reintegrate the world of production in a world where it was thought that things could be parceled out and you'd find the most efficient place to do this or that. And then you would pull it back together and piece it together. Musk was, and a lot of people thought he was mad, was one of the first people who said, no, we're going to do all of it. We're going to do everything from the mining through to the marketing. And that's not Fordist in the sense that Ford, I don't think, was trying to build a world in which people would end up inside the Ford universe. So their knowledge economy would be Ford-based and their family life would be Ford-based. Their cars would be Ford cars and they would earn enough to buy Ford cars. And it's almost harking back in a less benign way to that world of philanthropy in which the factory town and the factory life would envelop you. But we tend to associate that with well-meaning Quaker chocolate makers and others. What's so weird about the Muskist version is it has a little echo of that, and yet it's not benign in that way. It is a vision of a much harsher world in which integration is a survival strategy.
And then the other integration that Musk is obsessed with is this idea of integrating the human mind with the machine, right? I mean, he's very interested in, he set up Neuralink, this whole idea that actually in the future, men and machines will become one and that this will be a very good thing, which I think most sort of normal, ordinary people find bizarre and preposterous and like something that has probably come out of the mind of someone who's read too many science fiction novels as a kid. But he's very serious about it and very passionate about it. And I think it says something about the kind of technocratic mindset of a lot of the people that are driving the debate right now.
In the second part of this conversation, we're going to talk much more about AI and what it means for jobs. But I want to ask you about one other word that, when I was a child, was absolutely integral to the idea of work, which was career. The idea that a working life had an arc to it, it had a shape to it. Everyone at school was sent to a careers advisor, and you would be given often a miserable and terrifying vision of what your birth, school, work, death life might look like. But there were clearly other careers that were much more fulfilling. There were things called career progression. There was a shape to a working life in which retirement was a clearly defined category at the end of it. And if you do well, that would be your reward. It hasn't all gone, but a lot of that has gone. And it seems like that is one of the big changes, leaving aside the machines and what they're going to do to the world of work in the 21st century. And that does have something to do with demography as well, because there is another big shift that's underway, which is not simply about machine learning, which is to do with the fact that we live in societies that are aging very, very rapidly. So the form of labor that was never in short supply traditionally in human societies was young labor. There were always more young people than old people. The thing that was scarce was knowledge or education, the aptitude for certain kinds of work. And we now live in societies where there are fewer young people and there is a surfeit of education and qualification and aptitude. And also there are a lot of older people who are remaining in work. So obviously there are big changes underway in all sorts of spheres, but it sometimes feels like that, for now at least, might be the biggest one. I don't know, but actually demography is at least as important as the AI story in what is happening to the world of work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that personally, I think that people become way too pessimistic when they look at those old age dependency ratios, that you can access lots of scary looking charts if you go on World Bank database of the rate at which so-called working age people will have to be supporting many, many more people who are over 65, and that this looks sort of unsustainable. And of course, this is one argument that you might make in favor of automation, right? That if there are just going to be fewer people around to do the stuff that needs to be done, then we might just need more robots. But actually, humans are so much more adaptable than that. And the idea that 65 is some sort of cutoff at which you become dependent on everyone else in society is obviously not true. And it massively varies by country as well. So right now, 38% of over 65s are in work in South Korea, compared to 4% of over 65s in France. So I think it's quite possible that over time, we will simply work for longer, and that will be fine because we're also much, much healthier than we used to be. And there are many more jobs that are suitable for older people to do jobs that don't involve hard physical labour. The other thing that's happened that's been really big in the last 5-10 years has been the pandemic and the way in which that has hugely increased the acceptability and likelihood of being able to work remotely. This is another thing that's like really good if you want to improve the rate at which older people can stay in the labour market. So I'm not as concerned as everyone else that we're facing some sort of demographic cliff where suddenly there's just not enough people available anymore. But clearly it means that like the mix of work matters a lot. So if you were sitting and looking at those charts and you were thinking about what kind of automation would we like, you'd be thinking we need to automate away the really physically tough jobs, and we need to have more of the cognitive roles, the roles that people can do even if they are not in great physical health anymore, even if their stamina is not as great. What worries me slightly is that what seems to be happening is that this latest wave of automation is almost going in the opposite order, right? So it's a lot of the cognitive jobs that are at risk of being disrupted, whereas those blue-collar roles so far in many different sectors are actually proving quite hard to automate. There's a reason that those Amazon workers are still there, because actually coming up with a robot with the adaptability and dexterity of human hands is really tough. So that worries me slightly, that the form of automation that feels like it's coming is not necessarily well suited to those demographic charts and what they look like. But I have a lot of faith in human adaptability.
The other scare story that gets a lot of airtime relates to the other thing that I mentioned just before, which is we are, for the first time in human history, societies with a surfeit of people who are highly educated. And it's anecdotally the case, but I think it's also borne out in the statistics that it is becoming much, much harder for well-qualified young people to find the kind of work for which they are qualified, for which they have been trained. Is that something we should be more concerned about, in the sense that there you do hear stories, and we all know young people in these positions, where there is a real demoralization at the start of what used to be called a career, but one of the problems, it's really hard to think of it as a career anymore because there are no entry points, and these things don't have the arc of a career anymore, and they're told they're going to have to lead a portfolio life, but where do they make a start? Is that where the concern really should be? Actually, we've got a problem with supply and demand, which actually does have something to do with the ways in which we have qualified people for a world of work that probably doesn't exist anymore?
Yeah, I think that's really worrying. Although just to say that this isn't actually just a problem of graduates. So the graduate premium has definitely declined over time. So it used to be that because there were far fewer people going to university, that it was a kind of golden ticket. Like you were one of the minority that got a university degree, and then you would have access to good quality jobs that would give you a really decent, hefty wage premium above people who didn't. And that premium has declined over time as the supply of people going to university has increased. And I don't know why anyone should be surprised about that, really. But what's also concerning is that for people who now don't go to university, because that's become less common, those people have also seen their prospects dim. And the sort of progression ladder for people who didn't go to university from lower skilled, lower paid jobs up into middle skilled jobs has also been eroding. And so I think the problem is really for young people in their entirety rather than simply a graduate problem. But obviously, it's not great when you have gone to university and you have now incurred a huge amount of debt in order to acquire that degree, to find that it's really hard to get an opportunity that feels like it justifies it. And then that debt just sort of sits there and haunts you.
Is it essentially, as with all waves of automation, demographic change, a kind of misalignment problem, in the sense that I worked, as I said earlier on, in university for 30 years, and I know that universities are educating young people for a world that used to exist and probably doesn't exist anymore. And universities, but other well-established institutions, adapt slowly to a world that is changing quickly. So these things are just out of sync. And to be more optimistic about the future, they will come into sync eventually, in the sense that the misalignment, as with earlier phases in the Industrial Revolution will realign, because if we're training and educating young people for a world that doesn't exist, at some point, surely we will start training and educating them for a world that does exist. That would be the optimistic version. The two versions of pessimism there is it often takes a long time to realign, and that can be a human lifetime or a human working lifetime. Some people in the Industrial Revolution, many people never saw the benefits. They just lived in the miserable 30 years. But also, the world is moving so fast that we might never catch up, in the sense that I can't imagine that the universities that I know will ever catch up in the way in which they think about what it is to equip the young people that they are educating for the world that surrounds them. They'll always be 2 or 3 steps behind. And I'm instinctively pessimistic anyway, but on this one, I think the pessimism really rings loudly at the back of my head.
Yes, although, I mean, to put in a good word for the universities, seeing as you won't, it's not very easy right now. I mean, employers themselves haven't figured out what on earth to do about skills, about training, about hiring young people, about how to develop their expertise in this new world in which AI is beginning to do some of the tasks that junior people used to do on the way up. Like, we're in the foothills of what feels like quite a profound transformation, and literally nobody knows how it's going to go. So to expect universities to be equipping young people for a future that nobody can predict, I think, is asking too much of them. But I mean, on your point about over time, will we adjust? And I guess implicit in your question is, will there be more demand for highly skilled people in the future? I don't know. I mean, the age of computerization is sometimes described by economists as a period of skills-biased technological change, which basically means that computers weren't great for people in sort of middle-skilled manufacturing jobs. It hollowed out the sort of middle part of the labour market, but they were really good for people who already had skills and expertise in white-collar roles, because they enabled them to just do more cool stuff and generate more value. And as a result, what you saw was a kind of widening of wage inequality, and people at the top who really benefited from this wave of technological change did very well. Their working hours also went up, by the way, so it's not as if they banked that in terms of extra leisure. If you look at lawyers and management consultants, I mean, they now work the longest hours of all, but they've made really good money, and that's partly because technology, or that phase of technological change, really worked in their favour. What we just do not know right now is whether the next phase will be the same. There are some indications that maybe it will be. There are also arguments that it won't be at all, that it will, in fact, do the opposite, that the only jobs left will be manual trades and skilled trades and, jobs that involve people doing stuff with their hands, and that in the future there's not much point with anyone going to university, and everyone should maybe tell their kids to become plumbers right now. So we're in this moment of profound uncertainty, and I think to expect universities to know more than anyone else is to ask too much of them.
The second part of my conversation with Sarah O'Connor is available tomorrow as a bonus episode on PPF Plus. And in it, we really focus on the question of what AI is going to mean for the kind of work we all do. It is not a utopian conversation. It is not a dystopian conversation. Sarah is one of the few people who really understands how AI is changing the character of work already and what it means for all of us. If you'd like to hear that episode, see how this story ends, just go to the link in our show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com, and click on the page for PPF Plus. You will get all of our bonus episodes. There are more than 50 of them available now. You will get ad-free listening. You will get automatic sign-up to our fortnightly newsletter. It costs £5 a month or £50 for the year, and we would love to have you join. Sarah's book isn't out yet, but if you would like to pre-order it, it's called We Are Not Machines, The Fight for the Future of Work. We don't often talk about new books on this podcast. When we do, it's because we think they are really good. And that is true of this one. Next time in our regular slot, we're not going to be talking about whether Keir Starmer will stay or whether he will go. We're not going to be dissecting the results of the recent UK local elections, but I'm going to be talking to a series of contributors about the question of what is actually happening to British politics and whether we can apply some historical perspective to see whether this really is uncharted territory that we are entering. I will be speaking to Anthony Selden, who is the historian of Number 10 Downing Street and has written a series of books on all recent prime ministerships. I'm going to be talking to Hannah White from the Institute for Government, to Rob Ford, who was our guide earlier to the question of whether Nigel Farage will or won't become Prime Minister, and to two PPF regulars, Robert Saunders and David Klemperer, asking all of them if they can help us make sense of Keir Starmer's predicament in historical perspective. What does it mean, and what might be coming next? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.